Hello, everyone. Thank you much for participating. I am Stephanie Schrader. I oversee the education and outreach and diversity component of C-DEBI. And today is our first online seminar in our professional development series. And today we will have Jen Biddle talk to us about leveraging social media. So with that, take it away, Jen.
All right. Well, hi, guys. Thank you for joining us today. And I would like to let you know, I can't see the chat window right now. So Stephanie and Matt said they would read out chats to me, or we'll talk about it afterwards. So please feel free, if you have questions during this, pipe in via the chat window and GoToMeeting, or send me a tweet. So that's my Twitter handle up there right now. And so I wanted to start talking today about this idea of science communication and the idea of sort of pitching social media to you. And I wanted to ask you to think about how you hear about science. Do you hear about it only through journal articles? Do you hear about it through your friends or Google News? Do you hear about it through any social media channels that you use? Well, thanks to a couple of things, such as popular things like I effing love science and other news feeds, it turns out that social media is a pretty popular place for people to hear about things now. And you might think about how you hear about it, think about how your parents hear about it. Do they read only the science section of the LA Times, New York Times? Do they hear about it at all? Is it only on the nightly news? Is it only through programs like Nova or PBS? And then finally, think about how you would like to have people hear about your science. Do you want it to be through very controlled lines of communication, such as a PBS series, or would you rather hear it on the news or even on something like social media? And so I wanted to add this idea, which goes back to Kevin Bacon, which if you are too young to understand the Kevin Bacon reference, he's well known as the joke that, Kevin Bacon is well connected in Hollywood and that you're usually name any actor or actress and they're only 6 steps away from Kevin Bacon. Well, it turns out that in the world, actually, this was tested, and there's old experiments going back to even Pony Express days of delivering mail, and realizing that on average, people are pretty well connected. What's really impressive is that in an average community, when you think about the connections you have, you're not Kevin Bacon. You're actually usually connected with every 1 in 50 people, which is actually a lot of people. But if you're on social media, you're actually a lot more connected than that. So typically you're connected about 1 in every 6 people. So you do reach the level of Kevin Bacon. And so I wanted to pitch this idea to you today, and I use a very different way of pitching it, is to just think about the economy and how it works right now. And to think about how ideas spread and the value of the way the markets are working. And so there is this guy, Seth Godin, who's a marketing entrepreneur. And so he has this wonderful quote I love where he says, you're not going to make it as a worker bee, you're going to make it as someone who's figuring out what to do next. Whether or not you choose to be a marketer, you are one. And he says this in reference to thinking about how economics used to work. There used to be companies such as when Henry Ford started making the automobile, right? It was a guy who had a lot of money, he recruited a lot of workers, he piped out machines from his plant, and it was a very directed product. And that was a very vertical transmission of a product. Nowadays, when you think about a product, it's typically something that's acting very horizontally. So you think about the Apple model, right, where it basically starts with just a few people and then spreads very widely. And it's amazing if you think about examples of science, it turns out that new examples of science are fitting into this idea of horizontally spreading ideas very well. So if you think about the operating system of Linux or even R coding, these are all things that are spread horizontally and they're not controlled by just one person. There may be some stopgaps in terms of people that actually are at the ultimate control, but they're communities that are spread across the world and everyone's able to contribute. And so I really try to drive home to students when I talk about this idea that there's an old way of doing things, and that's the vertical way of doing things. It used to be you in your lab talking to your advisor, and your advisor talking to the paper editors, and those paper editors talking to the main editors, right? And having very vertical transmission of ideas. But right now we're in this economy that ideas can spread horizontally. And if you don't believe me, then just look at the news feed or look at any scientific publication like Nature News or anything like that. They're always talking about social media information. So ideas are able to spread very wide and go viral very quickly. And so there's been tests of this concept, right? So scientists are on social media. So this is from Nature. It was done in 2014. I don't think they've done an update since then. And you can look across here, this idea of what people know about. And so I think it's funny that they measure this from, I'm aware of this site and visit regularly in the dark blue colors. I'm aware of this site, but I don't visit it, and I'm not aware. And if you look across it, of course, Google Scholar is very popular. My department's using it for merit hiring raises right now to look at the Google Scholar updates in your H index that way. People know about ResearchGate and LinkedIn. They know about Facebook, and a lot of people say they don't use it, but I don't think they're actually being truthful. And then you look on down, and that these other things in terms of Google, Twitter, Researcher Idea, Mendeley, and Orchid, they're actually ideas that are increasing ever since 2014. And so these are numbers that are growing, and they're spreading, especially as more young people are coming into the scientific community. And so if you look across, the Nature study looked at how people use this. And so a lot of people say that they don't use Facebook professionally, and that makes sense, right? They do post some content, but that they mostly are using it in a personal manner and not professionally. However, you go to LinkedIn, and a lot of people use it in a very professional manner. So they want to have a resource in LinkedIn. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a career site where it's supposed to connect people looking for jobs or have networks about jobs. I now encourage my students, if they don't want to make their own web page, that they at least make a LinkedIn page, because they're very easy to see and they're very good for sort of looking at people's online CV. And if you work in an industrial setting, you actually have a lot of comments on each other's work habits. And a lot of my friends who are in industry, especially for science industry, have comments, excuse me, such as they were great to work with, they always got their projects done on time. And it's a great way to find jobs or peers that are in areas that you're interested in. I like really using it to see if people that I'm talking to, either bringing them into my lab or even talking to them as a reporter, who do they know that I know? Who are they? Yep.
You cut up for a second.
Okay. Is it good now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, again, so LinkedIn is looking at jobs and discovering people in the workplace. And I feel like people are either coming and going like crazy. I can't tell. I just hear beeps in my ears. All right, so finally we come to Twitter. And Twitter is a platform that is used in an interesting way. I feel like this talk should have changed based on the new US administration, because hopefully people are realizing how impactful Twitter can be now. But really, Twitter is used as a discussion. So it's a way to post content, it's a way to have discussions, and also just to kind of keep connecting. And so what I think it's funny is that a lot of people say they don't use it professionally, but if you see the percentage of people on this graph that say they don't use it professionally, is 20%, but yet 50% of them are following discussions. And so I don't know necessarily what they're talking about there, because they're discovering peers and posting work content. And so that's using it professionally in my mind. Excuse me. So I just saw this on Twitter, and a paper just came out on April 11th. And so it shows you the power of quick delivery. I saw it because a tweet, Eric Clementi, who writes a eruptions blog about volcanism, was poking fun at geologists that they're not really well represented. And so here you can see the scientists that are typically on Twitter using it as a platform. And so there's a lot of historians and psychologists. They rank as the most prolific users. But there's a good number of biologists and geographers and ecologists. And so within your discipline, there's probably someone on the platform in terms of your specific discipline. And so I tell people that when you think about the internet, how you're going to use it, it is out there, and you might not have an internet persona, and you might not want to use social media, but it's really important to know what is out there on you, because people do look at it, and if you're not using it, you're not able to control your message. So I would encourage people to consider using social media as a way to control your message and a way to network and a way to establish yourself as a scholar individually, even if you're working within a lab or you're not even yet in a lab and just looking towards getting somewhere. So people are out there using social media, and the question is, are you? Maybe you have an account and you're not using it very actively. Maybe you're a little bit nervous about using it, but let's talk about that. So I want to give you an example of social networking and how basically things work for science. And so this is a picture I found from the web, but to badly paraphrase this book called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. It was this book that talks about the idea of connectivity and the force for change it can have. And so we have these things called strong ties, and we have these things called weak ties. So strong ties would be the people you work with every day. These are the people either in lab with you or in your office with you, and they're the ones you see time over time and time. So that's a strong tie. That's someone who knows a lot about you. They know your spouse, they know your kids, they know your interests, they know your background. But then you have these weak ties, and these weak ties might be the person that you chat with at the bus stop. They might be someone you met at a conference. They might be someone who saw you give a talk or saw you at a poster, right? And so they know your name, they know a little bit what you're about.
We lost.
You guys hear me now?
Yep, you're cutting up, but yes.
Okay, I'm gonna try to do it not on my headphones because I don't know if they're causing an issue.
Okay, you cut out right when you were about to say, never mind, Ben just informed me that it's only cutting out for me. You are fine.
Okay, so
sorry to interrupt.
there are strong ties and weak ties on the internet, and apparently Stephanie has a weak tie. I'm kidding. All right, so okay, so you can think about this idea of which is better to have. Is it better to have strong ties or weak ties? Obviously, you need to have both, right? But we need to think about these weak ties being extraordinarily powerful. And one of the examples that Charles gives in his book is thinking about or basically the civil rights movement and how Rosa Parks became a key figure in the civil rights movement. Well, a lot of people had been arrested for doing basically acts of resistance for civil rights. But these people didn't have as much impact. And even if you look at a lot of the social movements that are going on right now, some impacts have more than others. And so it turns out that if you think about Rosa Parks and her role, she was a seamstress in her community. So she served both the Black and the white community. So when she was arrested, it wasn't only the Black community that was affected, it was also the white community. And that's why there was much more outcry and much more support behind the objection to her arrest. And that's actually why that was a breaking point in the civil rights movement, because she had this huge network of weak ties. And so when you think about that, think about who you're going to get a job. Are you going to get a job from the person who's sitting at the desk next to you? No, probably those persons at that same point in life. It's much harder for them to help you get a job. But would you get a job because someone saw a poster of yours at a conference and they liked it, right? That's that weak tie. That's more likely to actually happen. And so when you think about how you're going through science, we train our students very much to rely on strong ties, but I encourage my students to then also seek out these weak ties. That's hard to do when you're in a lab and trying to do a graduate degree. And so how are you going to manage this? And this is why I try to encourage people to adopt social media, because it's a way to quickly develop weak ties. So I'll tell you two things that I've done, why I joined Twitter and what I'm doing with it. So to be quite frank with you, I joined Twitter after I gave birth to my son, and I looked at all the statistics saying that women have trouble succeeding in academics when they have children. And I reached out to Julie Huber, who's in C-DEBI also, and I said, hey, Julie, you've done this. What's the secret? What do I need to know? How do I beat the statistics? And she said, join Twitter. And so it's all her fault, and that's on record now. But that Julie said that join Twitter, follow these couple of people, and you'll feel like you'll go to every single conference out there. And so I joined Twitter, and it was amazing. I could go to bioinformatics conferences, I could go to AGU or ocean sciences conferences, and I could learn about what was going on without having to be there in person. And so I've taken Twitter and adopted it as my platform to use. And I can tell you what I'm now doing with it. So what I'm doing with it is I've found collaborators, I've found students, I have found jobs for my students. And also, as I was doing one of these seminar trips for IODP as a speaker on the seminar series, I went to visit a school in the middle of Texas called Midwestern State University. And I was amazed to find out that I was the only speaker they were going to have on campus that year. Meanwhile, a friend of mine had reached out and said, I'm going to be on the job market and I need to give a practice talk. Is there any way you could invite me for a seminar? And so I had this simultaneous realization that there's this need for seminar series that aren't fixed in place, because I couldn't, frankly, put the person into my seminar series. It was already full at our institution. And I realized that these people at Midwestern State weren't able to get high power seminars throughout the entire year. And so I had this social media platform that I connected with a few other researchers on. So now it includes Cameron Thrash at LSU and Dave Baltras at Arizona. And we've created this thing called Micro Seminar. And so it has a WordPress website. We run it through a Twitter platform. All of the talks are given through Google Hangouts, and they're also broadcast by YouTube. And I'm showing you the views we had of the WordPress site the day that we hosted a researcher named Pat Schloss as our speaker. And so you can see here that we had views from all over the world, and we had almost 200 views of a seminar. And I love to go to seminars and ask people how many people were at your last departmental seminar, because let's face it, a lot of our departments are small, and we might only have 20 to 30 people at a departmental seminar. But here, with very little effort and a completely free platform, we've now reached over 200 people. The videos are still up on YouTube. We keep looking at the hits, and some of our videos have over 500 hits. And so we're able to then provide these scientific talks to people for free all over the world. And so hopefully I've convinced you that the internet is real and social media is real. And I think it's really important to think about what you know when you Google yourself. So if you don't know how the web searches work, web searches are actually, the results are updated based on the frequency of refreshing. And so a page that is updated more often would show up faster in the results than something that's not updated very often. And I always challenge my students to Google what they Google themselves. And do you like what you see? Is it your indiscreet pictures that you had in undergrad perhaps showing up? Is it your Facebook page that shows all of your hobbies that maybe you don't want everyone in the world to know about yet? And see if you would like an employer or an employee to see what is coming up with your Google hits. And what would you rather they find? And I listed this pipl.com website down there. It's actually called, it searches like the dark web, and so you can see what else, I should say the dark web, but it searches the non-common sites, and it shows you what people can find about you. Because maybe you're not worried about what you have on the internet, but maybe you don't know what's on the internet. So it's good to know what's out there about yourself. And so I would encourage you to try a social network and think about a strategy for it. So who else is on that social network that you might want to network with? I showed you the table before that there's 4,000 historians, and there's about 2,000 biologists on Twitter. So would you want to connect with them? Who is it that you wanted to network with? And if you haven't done this before as a strategy, you should think of a strategy. You should always go into social media with an idea of a goal or a reason for using it. And so do you want to just be you? Which I have to say I am. I put my Twitter handle as my job title, but I should really just change it back to me because I talk about everything on there. But you might want to be a pseudonym. And perhaps it's that you really want to champion rights for or discuss things such as underrepresentation in science, or you don't necessarily want to be completely identified of who you are. Maybe you want to complain about your advisor, which I'm sure my students have alternate Twitter accounts to do. Or maybe you want to be a brand. Maybe you want to think about this unique thing that you can offer and really push that. So maybe your Twitter handle would be something specific. For example, I have some friends where their Twitter handles are really the techniques that they're doing in lab. And so if you want to be, at amplicon sequencing or something like that, you could, and that could really sort of be that branding moment for saying what you're really good at. And so to be successful using social media, I really encourage people to find an anchor point. And so typically when you make that goal for social media, you can think about what you want to convey. And my goal for social media was really to convey that I am an accessible person in science and that I try to give the story the real way in terms of the stresses and the joys and the disappointments of everything that happened. And I do this partly because I'm in a very small department. And so it's really nice to be able to share things with the world, because otherwise the 10 people around me kind of get tired of hearing about it. The other thing for social media is that you have to remember to interact. It's not a static thing. If you're only pushing content or replicating content, it's not going to be very exciting for people. The other thing is to engage. If you see a discussion going on, you can jump into it. You can ask questions. If you see something that is interesting to you, you can respond to the person. I connected with Cameron Thrash to do the micro seminar partly because he kept tweeting papers I was really interested in. And I finally responded to him and said, are you actually sitting in my brain? Like, wow, we have really common interests. We need to talk more. And the other thing is to deliver content. So if you're someone who reads a lot of papers or a lot of news articles, then you can deliver content and think about spreading that information that you want to have spread. So just to introduce you to some Twitter lingo, because it's sometimes intimidating for people, it is a platform that is changing every month, it seems. And so a few things have changed on it. One thing that hasn't is that it's still 140 characters per message. This makes you really good at concise writing, because often I write a message and I realize it's too long, and then I sit there and try to decide what words I don't need. It now means that when I have an abstract due for a conference and it requires 1,000 words, I typically have trouble writing over 600 because I've gotten so concise in my writing. You can use things like hashtags to organize topics, and so I suggested like hashtag C-DEBI. If you tag a tweet with that, then you can then follow all those hashtags, or someone who is following that hashtag will be able to organize it better. You can do things like retweets, which is an RT or a quoting tweet, which is, again, just amplifying the message without adding anything to it for a retweet. You can do a direct message, which is a DM, and that's a direct message that won't be seen from by the rest of the world. They just started this new thing about like last week called a canoe, which now means that you can have up to 50 people on a message, because you used to have those people included as your character limit, and now those people are separate. It gets a slightly annoying thing, because if you add up to 40 people on one of these canoes, it means your phone keeps buzzing when you get the updates about the canoe going by. And how do you manage all of this? Well, I typically do it from a web browser or my phone. So on the phone, it's an app. From a web browser, I use TweetDeck. There's also something called Hootsuite. And if you're using this for more intensive operations, there's programs that will do analytics for you and schedule tweets. I like the fact that TweetDeck will schedule tweets for you. And so I can actually schedule in tweets. So it might seem that I'm on social media all the time, but a lot of times if you see something, it might have been that I've actually just scheduled it. It's been shown that Twitter gets very popular in the beginning of the day on the East Coast. It gets very popular at around noon, which is lunchtime on the East Coast, or when people on the West Coast are starting to check in. And then it's very popular from about 5 to 8 p.m. And so those are usually those times that people are checking in as they're kind of going through their day and looking at things. So what you might want to do is, if you have something interesting to provide, even if it's, let's say, a C-DEBI announcement, you might want to try to schedule tweets for those high user times where you know it's going to have more traffic and be seen. So, Seth Godin is this marketing entrepreneur, and he talks about how to succeed on the internet. And he says, do something genuine that connects rather than something fake that is entertainment. And while I agree with him, I think actually both sides work. And so I do have to say that when I see people using social media, if it's a very dry delivery and it's only information and there's no sort of engagement or opinion actually let out with it, or even for scientists, if there's no view of what you are as a person, then it's harder for people to engage with it. And so I encourage people to think about how much personality they want to add into their account. Do they want it to be 50% or 10%? Typically something sneaks through. I should tell you also that there's a lot of people on the internet that are very successful on Twitter, and they have thousands of followers. And what's really impressive is that they say nothing about their personal lives. And so it's possible to do that. I joke with my students that I'm not smart enough to do that. And so basically what you see is what you get. And you hear about everything on my account, from the movie like Frozen to zucchini bread recipes to science and everything that's going on in it. So you're hearing me say social media is great, and it's certainly something I've adopted to succeed. And do you need to do it? No. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. But I will tell you that it has value and benefit, and the value and the benefit depends, right? So it maybe has benefit, it depends. It depends on how you use it. What I will also suggest is that I see the internet as a great equalizer. And so it's a way to shrink the world, and you can bring together students and colleagues. And I think it's really exciting, especially if you're doing work outside of your country, to think about the fact that it offers access to students and scientists in developing countries. There are a lot of people outside the US on the Twitter platform. In China, it's actually a separate platform, but you're able to get an account on that if you're interested. And so to think about this idea of really broadening science, if you want to connect outside of your own home department or your home institute, it's a great way to connect. And so there's actually a paper that's been published, and it discusses how Twitter can basically create a larger virtual department. And so this is a figure from this paper from 2013, where they looked at the size of the academic department compared to how many Twitter followers there were. And what they saw, it's on a log scale. And so that red line would be if it was a one-to-one relationship of academic department to Twitter followers. But what you can see here is that if you have a small academic department, you typically have a high range of Twitter followers. And like I said, it's kind of, for me, a way to discuss things with the outside world. If you don't know about me, I sit on this branch campus right on the ocean, which is lovely, except it means that I don't have the access to a normal university that other people do. And so I don't get to go to seminars in biology or other departments. Half the people here talk about marine things that I don't deal with, right? And so I want to talk about the deep biosphere, I want to talk about microbiology, and my colleagues want to have talks on shark migrations. And that's great, except that for me, it's not as intellectually stimulating. I call sharks big bags of carbon, so that's recorded, it could be online now. But and so as you look forward, you can see that there's actually a large difference between the size of the department versus the number of followers that occur. And if you think it's all just goofing off, well, if you look at who's following scientists, they went through and saw that the majority of students actually will follow scientists. And what's really impressive is now when I go to give a lecture, typically about 10% of the audience already knows me from my Twitter following, which was really impressive to me when it's happened, when people come up and they know a lot about me and they start conversations immediately. And so I call it networking on steroids. And it's a great way for me to be interacting with students. As you look across, you can see that there's other things like other academic scientists, other scientists, environmental NGOs, media, and science organizations. And so typically that this is a way to, again, have information going back and forth. And don't underestimate the fact that science organizations and journals might be following you, because it's amazing that they now use this as a way to find experts to comment on journal articles. So again, if you open up Nature News, which is one of the biggest scientific news organizations that's out there, then if you look through their articles, typically half of them are based on tweets. Again, this has all gotten worse with the US administration. But so to try to convince you, times are changing and ideas are flowing horizontally. And so this isn't being used by our very old colleagues. It's often being used by the young colleagues. And so there's a higher frequency of usage as people are closer to their gaining of their academic degree. So again, you probably won't find the seasoned Nobel Prize winners on this network, but you'll typically find people who are younger and more engaged in terms of ideas shifting. And so I pulled this figure from an older paper, but it's this other idea too, has been seen a few times. If you think about the idea that you would communicate science through just publishing an article. Well, you can think about the citations you get of a paper. And if we look at this, you can see that after about a year of publication, you start gaining citations for your paper. However, if you look at the tweetations, or people talking about your paper, this typically raises within the first 50 days of your paper being published, and then would stay high as it's moving on in time. And so you basically get a total high number of tweetations before you would ever get a citation. And so I love this as a way to keep up with the scientific literature, because there's a lot of articles that get shared on social media that are really good. Typically, when an article isn't that good, it's not shared that widely. And so I know when I see an article go by a few times, it's a really good one to check into. And if you're a student, or if you're just starting out, you might not appreciate the fact that there is so much scientific publication getting out there right now that it's ludicrous. There's no way you can keep up with it. There's hundreds of papers published each day. And so using Twitter as a filter is a way that I use it. It might not be a fair filter, but it's a way I'm using to try to filter down the information I have. And so there's caveats with this. And if you haven't seen the news, you probably have missed the fact that there have been people that are fired from their jobs for tweeting awful things. If you've seen the firestorms going on, again, think about the current US administration. Every time Trump was twittering something, it was raising and dropping stock prices. And the other thing you should know is that not everyone on the internet is nice. And so there is this problem of trolls, and Beth Orcutt had asked me to talk about this. I should say I haven't really had a problem with it. I typically just ignore them when someone says something that isn't quite favorable in my opinion, or something that I don't really want to engage with. I usually just don't even engage them. But I know some of my friends who talk a lot about climate science and climate change, they get awful trolling. And there have been really bad examples of things that have happened. The nice thing about the Twitter platform is you're able to mute them, and you're able to then ignore things that you don't want to see. I have other friends that do engage them and they respond back to them. It's usually not for much effort. And so most social media professionals will tell you to just not engage and mute them and ignore them. And typically you do stay inside your own echo chamber. And again, if you're not talking about controversial topics, the trolls usually don't pop up. So that's the end of the talk I have. Oh, and I was cutting out for someone else. And so if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. And thank you guys for listening.
All right, thanks so much, Jen. If anyone has questions, you can type it in the chat box. Jen, can you see the chat box?
Yeah.
Okay, you can see it now. Okay, then I will not read it to you. I do have a question. Oh, okay. Oh, you're live. All right. So I was wondering, you mentioned that for your Twitter account, you specifically just throw it all out there and what you see is what you get. But in the current political climate, do you feel the need to kind of separate your identities when talking about different topics, basically reflecting that as a scientist, you're an expert, and this is you being, you know, a scientific perspective versus, say, your personal beliefs or political views?
Yeah, so I would say that people do caveat sometimes their accounts by saying the views on this account aren't necessarily views of my employer. What's nice is really knowing that where you stand. And if I was working at a public institution, I'd be a little bit more concerned about this, especially if I was portraying myself as the professor on social media. Frankly, if I was at a public institution, I'd probably separate my accounts and have a very science-directed account and have a much more personal account. But thankfully, I work at a private institution, and we're actually really well protected by free speech clauses. I am slightly nervous. My dean does follow me, and I know that now, it was much better when my entire department wasn't on Twitter. And so I am conscious of this, and I try to think about, again, do you want this tweet to be said back to you? Do you want to be told to your colleague? I wouldn't share information that I didn't want other people to know that I'm in favor or against. And so I have taken a pretty political stance on my tweeting events lately. And I do wonder all the time, would this make a conservative student in my class feel very bad? And I try to think about that. And I do temper myself sometimes, which you might be surprised if you actually watch my feed. But I am thinking about, do I want this to be repeated? The sort of thing is, do I want this to be shared with a mom or a grandma, right? Like, think about, again, how it's going to be shared, because of course, any of the information that you're putting out there can be used against you. And if you haven't followed the news, right, people are looking at people's social media accounts about getting through customs lately. I'm glad I watch a lot of criminal drama because I know about burner phones, and it's crazy to think that this is what we might have to do going through customs. But on the other hand, again, I'd stand against anything that I have in that account. And so I think it's, again, you have to decide where you're going to draw the line. And so I know some people keep their Twitter accounts very dry and they don't put any personal information in them. And that's done very consciously. And so, okay, I just got a question from Beth. So how do you approach engaging with students that are in classes being social media? So that's a great question. So I typically don't engage directly for my class. So people typically are, I kind of get a feeling of who's in my class, but I usually don't share specific information about my classes on Twitter, except for the one class I teach that is actually on social media. And so I don't think it would be an unfair advantage for students because I'm usually not sharing information that I wouldn't be sharing through a course website or any other way. I try to keep I don't try to have a overly friendly relationship with students that are currently in my classes. However, once a student gets out of my class, they know it's a great way to keep in touch with me. And so I will tag people if I know there's something that's good for them. There's even some students that if I see job opportunities come off, I now unashamedly just send them the tweet instead of just sending them the link. And so I try to tell people that I'm on it. I see it as networking on steroids. And so I don't think it's necessarily an unfair advantage for students because everyone's getting equal access to me through that. And so, okay, there's a question about looking for a job and mixing personal political. So yeah, so if you're a foreign national in the current political climate, I would say that if you're applying to a science position, most people are probably in agreement with you. But it's something that you want to take in consideration in terms of, again, any of these words can be sort of held against you in court. And I kind of joke all the time that if you look at a lot of the news articles and if someone goes on a killing spree, people go through their social media accounts, Twitter and Facebook, and they'll say, oh, like 6 months ago, this person was tweeting all these nasty things, and obviously this is an awful person, right? And so is anyone to say that about you if you went on a killing spree tomorrow? Hopefully you don't. But that you want to think about, again, these words can be held against you. And so if you want to say things like stand up for science, or this is what I believe in, or I just shared a news feed and didn't have any comment on it, I don't see anything bad about that. I will say it's a very split thing right now that younger professors are more aware of this than older professors. And if you apply to my department, I'm going to be Googling you. I'm going to be background checking you. Some of my older colleagues don't do that. And so I think it's a mixed bag in terms of kind of knowing who you're playing to. But I'd say it the other way is if you look at a department and they're on social media, you can engage with them before you ever interview. And so again, you might want to keep a more personal feed for a while or more straightforward science feed for a while. No one's going to dig 5 years into your Twitter history. Like, that doesn't really happen, except if you're Donald Trump and people use the tweets against you. But that you can have something that shows you're engaged and shows your interests and use it as more of a science delivery feed for a while. And then if someone checks your social media account, they'll say like, oh, this is great. Jackie's really interested in DNA sequencing. I see she's really up on the latest, she's been watching the PacBio developments. She's been watching the developments on Oxford Nanopore, like this is a really person who's really tuned into things. And a lot of people would really like that. I will say this other thing here that I haven't been able to prove yet, but I've kind of noticed that there's a lot of foundation funding going to people with social media backgrounds. And so people know it's a way to get messages out there. And so you can use it in a very strategic way Again, if you're on the job market, you might want to change your strategy. I thankfully have the comfort now of, well, like in 3 weeks being tenured, so I can speak much more freely than perhaps someone who's just going for a postdoc job. Okay, so appropriate for students, undergrad or grad, to discuss, share, comment on research topics on social media. Okay, so if you don't have the expertise, you're welcome to ask questions. I will say, if you're working in someone else's lab, it's a really good idea to talk to your professor about what their strategy is. I have colleagues that are very anti-social media and they don't want anything shared. And then there's like me, and my students know that when there's a question, I say, like, I don't know, go tweet someone and figure this out. And actually just did that today, where I reached out to someone who I knew way more about this technology and this software design than I did. And so I reached, and a student asked me a question. I said, oh, go talk to this other person, and we'll connect you guys. And so again, it's a way that I take questions. I'll know that people are interested, and I then take the question off Twitter and use an email conversation to follow up. And so I would say, if you really don't know what you're talking about, then step carefully. But I think if someone's doing a method or doing something and you ask for more information, or like, hey, could you provide a link on this? What's really hilarious is that people respond to Twitter quite quickly. I can tease Pete Girgis because this just happened. I sent him an email and he didn't respond to me, and then I tweeted him the next day and he responded to me in 10 minutes. So this is a way for people to basically engage at a different level. And what's amazing is I've actually had conversations with people that make products and are much more advanced, and sort of I didn't think they would respond to me, but I tweeted at them and they actually respond quite quickly. And so again, know how much information you're able to share from lab, sort of know when to step your toe in. If you ask a really dumb question, no one will respond. And that's a good way to know that you asked a really dumb question. But if you ask a good question, people typically pick it up and will play around with it for a while. And so I wouldn't be nervous about stepping in, or at least just seeing it, and trying to figure out a way to get into it. And that's something where you can start with people that are more known to you in real life. So if there's someone in your department or someone you've worked for or someone in your network, like me, that's on a social media platform, you could sort of interact that way, and that way you kind of have a friendly face to start with, and from then start spreading the conversations outside. And I will say that there's a question from, I guess technically whoever's tweeting from C-DEBI before, that was asking how much time I spend on social media, and I admit I spend too much time on social media, but again, I'm sitting kind of at the end of a state with no one around me, and so it's a great way for me to kind of keep my sanity. You'll typically see that I'm like active when I first come into work, I'm active during my lunch break, and then I'm more active when I'm putting my kid to bed. And so people aren't active all the time, but typically people get back to you in a few hours, and so conversations can go throughout the day. I try not to let it, some days I'm off of it and I don't touch it at all. And I don't even know if people notices that, because people are like, oh, you're always on it. I'm like, no, I'm actually not always on it. But that it is something that you can kind of let over control your life. So I think if you're just starting out, it's good to have an idea of like, okay, I'm only going to do this during my lunch break, or I'll make this, like, if I get this experiment done, I'll like spend 10 minutes as a reward on Twitter or something like that. And not let it overtake your life, but that it is something that if you put the effort into, it's really valuable. The other thing I wanted to mention was conferences. If you go to a conference, there's always a hashtag for that conference. It's awesome to use the hashtag and check into Twitter during a conference. I love the fact that I'll know that my friends are going to other talks. And sometimes like I can just sit there and I basically watch the talk in simulcast with the talk I'm in. And it's a great way to share things. And it's, I think, really great also to see who else is in the audience and what they're responding to in the talk you're in, and kind of helping keep each other notes. I actually have my Twitter account to set up to go to a if this then that account, and then that goes to a Google Drive document. So if you see me tweeting a lot at a conference, I'm literally taking notes for myself. And so those all go into notes. And so it's multitasking and a way to be more efficient. All right, so there's a question from Stephanie. So do I worry about sharing new unpublished results? Haha. So again, know your collaborator. I saw a graph go by the other day where someone tagged their collaborators on it and were like, oh, look how awesome this is. And I thought, oh my goodness, I wouldn't have done that. And so I think that there's again, a level of discretion. You can worry about being scooped. You can worry about doing something amazingly bad. I would say if you're tweeting in lab, always make sure that you're not like, rejecting safety rules. If you're out in the field, make sure that everyone has proper equipment on and you're not showing anyone's like butt or something like that. If you're taking pictures, and just again, have an idea of what's going on. And so I don't really worry about publishing unpublished things. I know I've put some hints of things on social media. We haven't got the papers out yet. But I feel like there's so much going on in science right now, it's really hard to get scooped. And I say that actually having been scooped last year, that was fun. But that there's a lot going on, and so people don't pay attention that closely. But if it's really precious, I would again have an idea of how much you're going to release, or definitely don't show a picture of your colleague in lab in shorts and sandals when the EHS department says you should have closed-toed shoes and long pants on. So, any other questions? Concerns about okay. All right, so there's the conferences and tweeting at a conference. It is a touchy issue, and so conferences now have a policy. So if you go to a conference, check their introductory material, because there's typically going to be a social media statement. This became a big issue. I think it was about last year or the year before that at the Ecological Society of America conference, and people think there's a huge blow up about whether or not you should be tweeting at a conference. Most conferences have come down on the side of openness. And what they do is they ask a person to not tweet, or they ask you to say to not tweet the talk and make that the presenter's directive. So if you're at a conference and you don't want anyone to tweet your results, you should put on your title slide, please don't tweet this talk. What I usually do is the opposite, and I'll put the Twitter icon on and say, please tweet this talk, that's fine. Again, if you're worried about getting scooped, that's fine. I don't think, again, that happens very often, but of course it could. What I try to do is I would tweet a lot in the beginning of a talk, and then as you're getting towards the end and it's more unpublished data, I usually slow down and only tweet a very vague statement. So it's usually very hard to backtrack what I'm saying to what anyone's doing. But my goal is that if someone was there and read your abstract, which they're usually available online, that I would have captured what was in the abstract in my tweets. I especially tweet harder when they have a publication reference on the slide. Again, if they say that it's unpublished, I typically would speak less about it and just say a generality. So people get sensitive about it, but on the other hand, as I think about my colleagues that have just had kids, and I think about my colleagues that have, frankly, long-term illnesses and they can't travel to conferences. And I feel really strongly that they shouldn't be sidelined, right? And if you can't go to a conference, you often lose out a lot on science for that year. So I would think about it that way, and that you're actually helping people by tweeting it. And if it's something that I would have emailed a person privately to say, hey, look, this is going on, then I could put it on Twitter and everyone could know. I don't think it's very common that people have that. Typically people's angers would get up and then they realize nothing bad comes about it. But I would definitely follow the conference proceedings, whether or not they encourage it. Oh, and to actually answer your question that you asked is, if you're publishing unpublished data, then you should definitely you should make a statement of, okay, this is unpublished, please don't tweet this, or yeah, but once you talk about something at a conference, it's basically public information anyway. So people do see that differently, but however, are you going to penalize people if the 30 people in the room heard it and 10 other people on the internet saw it? It's very rare that hundreds and thousands of people are going to see any tweet that you have. And so that's just kind of the reality of it. And so again, I know I've talked about some stuff. Actually, I really need to get those papers out, but I'm not too worried about people scooping us. Again, saying that having been scooped last year, so that was wonderful. But. All right, any other questions?
Did anyone tweet questions at you?
I don't think so. Oh, I do. No? What else? I don't think I have any questions on Twitter now. Okay. All right, well, with that, you guys know how to find me now. And so I would just encourage you to think about the fact that this is a way to stay connected. I know a lot of people that were actually on this dial-up, I've connected through social media with already, and I think it's a great way to really build a strong community. And especially to consider things like the fact that right now we did this talk without spending too much carbon, right? And every time we get on a plane, every time we travel to do something, every time you host a departmental seminar, there's so much energy involved in getting that person there, that the more we can do virtually and through social networking, it's just better for the planet, and it's better for, frankly, people who are often underprivileged communities in science. And so consider that, and that's why I adopted it. And I frankly don't care if you do or not, but I encourage you to.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much, Jen. We are virtually giving you a round of applause right now. And that was a great way to introduce our new webinar series. We are planning on having another professional development talk in a couple months or so. And once we have our speaker nailed down, we will send out an announcement about it. And we are looking at, so just for some background about this series, what I did was essentially poll some of the C-DEBI PIs and senior scientists and ask them what they didn't learn in graduate school that they particularly needed now. And so we will be talking about some of the soft skills and different topics that they, and myself included, definitely use on a day-to-day basis. So with that, thank you everyone in attendance. And and this will be recorded and put on the C-DEBI website.
Thanks, Stephanie.